I live in a remote part of northern Maine, where the dense forest seems endless, and the closest neighbor is nearly a mile away. My house is small and modest, surrounded by trees, with only a dirt road leading in or out. The isolation has always been something I valued. However, this wasn't the reason I bought the house. In fact, even though I enjoy being secluded, I often feel lonely and afraid of the solitude. It's not the first time that strangers have come onto my property and tried to break into my home. Luckily, when I was renovating it, one of my priorities was to install sturdy doors and windows. Even though small incidents had happened before, none were severe enough to make me seriously question the safety of my home, until this particular event. It happened in the winter of 2020, during a month of relentless rainstorms. The sound of rain pounding on the roof had become a constant companion, almost soothing. That night, I was curled up on the couch with a book when I heard an unexpected knock at the door. I jumped a little. I was reading a horror novel, and my mind was already racing. Before I had time to reach the door, there was another knock. The sound startled me. Visitors were rare, especially at night, and especially unannounced. Not to mention that we were in lockdown. People weren't supposed to be wandering around the streets. My unease grew as I cautiously opened the door, just a crack. Standing there in the rain was a man, maybe in his early 30s, completely soaked. His clothes were muddy, his face pale, and he looked utterly exhausted. He claimed to have gotten lost while hiking in the woods. He carried no bag or supplies, and his appearance was disheveled. Something about the situation felt off, but he seemed desperate. Despite that, I couldn't bring myself to let a stranger into my home at night. At the same time, I couldn't just leave him there without help, so I told him to wait outside while I called the police and grabbed a blanket and some food. His expression shifted completely, but only for a fleeting moment. So brief that I couldn't be sure if I'd really seen it, or if my mind was just playing tricks on me. I closed the door behind me and made the call. I was pleasantly surprised by the response. On the other end of the line, they warned me to be cautious. A series of break-ins had been reported nearby, with homes being ransacked, and one incident involving a fatality. They gave me a set of instructions to follow to ensure I could offer help without putting myself in unnecessary danger. As I hung up the call, I felt a wave of unease again, as if something was about to happen. I prepared some food, grabbed a blanket, and went back to the door. But the man was gone, so I closed it and peeked through a window. That was a clear bad sign. Either the man was disoriented, which didn't seem likely, or he had decided to leave when I mentioned the police, meaning he wasn't here with good intentions or as defenseless as he had claimed. I stayed alert, but the rain and wind were so heavy that it was hard to make out anything outside. I had been watching through the window for a while when, in the distance, among the trees, I saw what looked like a light. It was as if someone had switched on a flashlight and was signaling to someone else. Then, I saw something that made my heart stop for a few seconds. Emerging from the trees was a group of people. I couldn't make out distinct shapes, but I clearly saw them appearing and spreading out across the property. I had called the police some time ago, but there was still no sign of them. I was painfully aware of how isolated I was. The access road to my house, old and unpaved, could easily have been rendered impassable by the storm, something I'd experienced before. My mind was spinning, running through every possible outcome. I knew that if the police didn't get here soon, those men would eventually find a way inside, and I was alone, defenseless against so many. That's when I remembered the hidden spot in the basement. I quickly went down to the basement, where there was a nearly hidden door. It was one of those rare features found in older houses, designed to hide people or valuable items. When I was renovating the house, I remember wondering whether I should keep that space or tear down the walls to make a bigger basement. I had chosen the first option. 10 minutes passed. The rain continued to pour, and the house was quiet, except for the occasional creak of the old wood settling. Then, I heard it. A faint noise, coming from the direction of my tool shed. It was subtle at first, like something being dragged. My heart started racing. When I bought the house, I was told the full story. For years, the house had belonged to a wealthy family. The father had many enemies, and because of this, he constantly received threats against himself and his family. Fearing that one of those threats might one day become real, he had that space built in the basement. The thing is, it wasn't just a simple hiding spot. It was an escape route. The room had 2 entrances and 2 exits, connecting the house directly to the tool shed. I tried to stay calm. No one who didn't know the house would ever find that passage. It had been built too well, which is exactly why I had kept it. I just needed to stay calm and breathe. But I didn't even have time to put my thoughts into action. Not a second later, I heard the door to the passage from the shed open. They knew about that passage, and if I didn't think fast, they'd be at my side in a matter of minutes. I quickly left the space and closed the door behind me, then dragged one of the furniture pieces in the basement to block the passage. I needed as much time as I could get until the police arrived. I rushed up the stairs and froze, heart pounding, at what I saw. One of the windows was shattered, which meant some of them were already inside. I scanned the room, panic rising, and then I heard footsteps upstairs. Without wasting another second, I flung open the front door and bolted into the storm. The house was as good as gone. Out here, I stood a better chance. The forest was pitch black, the ground slippery with mud, but I didn't stop. I ran blindly, crashing through branches and stumbling over roots, desperate to put as much distance between me and the house as possible. Eventually, I found myself crouching in a ditch near the road, shivering and soaked to the bone. I don't know how long I stayed in that state, terrified and frozen to the bone, only coming back to life when I finally saw the police car lights appear down the street. When the officers searched my house, the men were gone, but what they found was dark. Near the broken window, they discovered a hammer and a length of rope. In the tool shed, they had disturbed several items, including knives and heavy tools. It was clear they had been planning something far more sinister than just a burglary. Not to mention they knew about that entrance. I don't know how. I had never mentioned it to anyone. But the reality is, they knew. Had they been exploring the house before? Then I remembered an incident that had happened about 2 months earlier. The lockdown had eased a bit, and I took a week to visit my parents' house. I hadn't seen them in over a year, and with the world plunged into uncertainty, I didn't want to miss the chance to see them. I spent a week away, and when I returned, some things didn't add up. It felt like someone had been inside the house, but there were no signs of forced entry. I eventually brushed off that feeling, and up until that moment, I hadn't thought about it again. For weeks after the incident, I stayed with a friend in town, too terrified to return. When I finally did, I installed an alarm system, reinforced every door and window, and barricaded the interior passage. Still, the fear has never fully gone away. Even now, on stormy nights, I lie awake in bed, listening for the slightest sound, wondering if they are still out there, waiting for another chance. Hey, Horror Spectator here. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on post notifications so you're always in the loop when new videos drop. We post 2 videos every week. If you're really into this content, consider sharing it with your friends. It really helps us grow this community. Now, let's move on to the second story. It was a dark and cold night. I knew I had to get home quickly. My wife would start worrying soon. But I was in the middle of painting a wall, and leaving it for the next day wasn't an option. I was at my grandparents' old house, trying to fix up part of the structure. They had passed away years ago, and time hadn't been kind to the place. For the longest time, that house gave me an unexplainable unease. When I inherited it, I ended up ignoring it entirely. But times changed, and with rising costs and the need for some extra income, I decided to dedicate my evenings to renovating it. The goal was to sell or rent it as soon as possible. That night, December was baring its teeth. The cold was biting, and my hands could barely grip the paintbrush. The work was exhausting, and there wasn't a soul around. The streets were plunged into absolute darkness. I was tempted to call it a night, but I pushed on. After all, I was almost done. Then, out of nowhere, I heard music. It was coming from the house's courtyard. It felt surreal. I thought it might be my phone, but it wasn't a familiar tune. Definitely nothing modern. I walked to the window, but saw nothing. The sound stopped, and I forced myself to brush it off. A few minutes later, as I was packing up my things, the music started again. This time, it was unmistakably coming from the courtyard. I looked out the window again, but the darkness revealed nothing. Unease began to creep in. Grabbing a flashlight, I decided to check it out. The sound led me to an old device, a gramophone. It was sitting right in the middle of the courtyard, spinning and playing. I stood there stunned. I glanced around, but the place seemed deserted. The silence broken only by the eerie, mechanical melody. Suddenly, I sensed movement behind me, coming from the direction of the house. I spun around quickly, but saw nothing. The feeling of vulnerability grew stronger, and that's when I realized my mistake. I had left the front door open. I rushed back inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it from the inside. I continued packing my things, determined to finish the job the next day. Just as I was about to leave, my phone rang. It was my wife. She asked if I was still at my grandparents' house, and, upon hearing that I was, requested a favor. Could I grab a box of clothes from my dad's old room? Although the house was empty, we still used it to store some items. I stayed on the phone with her as I climbed the stairs, asking her to specify which box it was. But that unsettling feeling I'd felt earlier returned, this time accompanied by a distinct sensation. Like I was being watched. When I entered the room, I quickly found the box. Then, out of nowhere, a vivid and unnerving sound echoed from downstairs. Something was moving. A chill ran down my spine. Suddenly, it all made sense. The gramophone in the courtyard wasn't a coincidence. It was a distraction. Someone had entered the house while I was outside. I whispered to my wife to call the police immediately and hung up. She heard the urgency in my voice and didn't argue. Now alone, my mind raced. Someone was inside the house. I had to be faster than them. I grabbed a pair of scissors lying nearby and started down the stairs cautiously. But when I reached the bottom, the living room appeared empty. Acting on pure instinct, I bolted toward the front door. Terror turned to sheer desperation when I realized the key I'd left in the lock was gone, and the door was shut tight. Whoever it was, they were playing with me. They wanted me trapped. Panic washed over me. This intruder was confident, real, tangible, and likely armed. For a moment, I froze, trying to decide my next move. Barricading myself in a room seemed like the safest option. The windows were old and hard to open. Trying to escape through one would take too long. The closest room was the bathroom. I started moving quickly, but before I reached it, I heard a metallic sound behind me, like something being dragged across the floor. Instinctively, I turned around. There he was, a towering man, dressed in black, dragging a bat across the ground. His face was partially covered by a scarf, leaving only his eyes visible. And those eyes were smiling. Slowly, he raised the bat and slapped it against his palm, taunting me. Fear turned into raw instinct. Without thinking, I grabbed a paint can from the floor and hurled it at his face. The man staggered, paint covering his eyes. He slipped and fell onto the carpet. I didn't waste a second. I lunged for the bat he had dropped, and in a desperate move, used it to knock him out. Then, I opened a window and jumped outside, running to my car without looking back. Moments later, the flashing lights of police cars lit up the street. I let out my first sigh of relief. I had survived. When the officers entered the house, they found chaos, paint splattered everywhere. But the man was gone. He must have slipped out the back when he heard the sirens. I never went back to my grandparents' house after that. What haunts me most isn't the attack, but the uncertainty. Why? I've never had enemies, never done anything to provoke such vengeance. The real terror is knowing he could come back, without warning, to finish what he started. Everything happened way too fast, and ever since then, I felt like time has stopped. I can't pinpoint the exact day, but it was late November. The cold that night was so sharp it feels like I'm still carrying it with me. No matter how many layers I wear, I never really feel warm. Caleb and I live in a miserable, almost crumbling house. One of the walls has a hole we kept trying to patch up with pieces of wood and duct tape, but the freezing wind always found a way in. What little we earned barely covered food and basic bills, let alone heating. We had no choice but to endure the winter as best we could. That night, I was home alone. It wasn't unusual for Caleb to disappear for a few days, always caught up in the trouble he preferred not to talk about. Once, he was gone for almost a week, and only came back after I got desperate enough to call the cops. When he returned, it was as if nothing had happened. That was Caleb, always in trouble, but deep down, still the same lost kid I grew up with. He was my only friend, my only brother, even though we weren't related by blood. And like brothers, we took care of each other. We both grew up with complete neglect. Our parents were never around, so we ended up like the other kids in our neighborhood, raised by the streets. I always managed to distance myself from it and cope, more or less, with the feelings I carried inside me. But for Caleb, growing up alone without a parent's love was too much to handle. While I was heating water for tea, one of the few ways to trick myself into feeling warmer, I heard knocks at the door. It wasn't unusual for someone to show up at that hour, but there was something about these knocks that made me freeze. They weren't ordinary. They were demanding, urgent. My body tensed up. I hesitated to approach the door, but a second knock, even louder, made me flinch. The clock read 11:30 p.m. Late, but not late enough to justify the panic I was starting to feel. I didn't think it was someone trying to rob the place. We had nothing worth stealing, but Caleb had received threats before. Before I could decide what to do, the sound of shattering glass filled the air. I turned just in time to see a brick smash through the living room window, scattering shards everywhere. The sight was shocking, but thankfully, instinct kicked in. I ran away from the living room, trying to think of the most efficient plan of action. I couldn't escape through the window. They'd catch me before I even got it open. I knew they were already inside the house. I could feel it even before I heard the heavy footsteps and angry voices. My first instinct was to run to the bedroom. I might have tried to lock the door, but that lock had stopped working a long time ago. I could hear them outside, moving through the house like predators on the hunt. They were destroying everything in their path, leaving chaos behind. Every sound seemed amplified, as if the thin walls of the house were reminding me of how fragile my safety was. My heart was pounding so hard it was almost painful. The people around here weren't to be messed with, and for them to break into someone's house like this, the situation had to be serious. I covered my mouth with my hand, trying to muffle my breathing, but the air felt too heavy. The only good thing in all of this was that, so far, they didn't seem to know someone was home, or at least, I hoped they didn't. I hid under the bed, but I quickly felt exposed. It was an obvious hiding spot, and I knew they'd look there. I waited until I heard their footsteps move slightly away, and then moved to the closet. Inside, the smell of damp wood and old clothes was suffocating, but the fear was worse. I pressed my hand tightly over my nose and mouth. Any sound, no matter how small, could give me away. Looking back now, I realize how precarious the situation was, how it would have taken a miracle to get out alive. But in the moment, instinct took over, and hope was the last thing to die. I heard the bedroom door burst open with a crash that made me shake. They were already in the room with me. They moved like giant shadows, opening drawers, shoving furniture aside. They were like beasts hunting prey. I heard one of them move to another room while one stayed to search the bedroom. I don't know how I managed to stay still, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. But where would I go? There was no escape, only the oppressive silence and the sound of destruction. Then the closet door opened. The dim light from the hallway lit up the face of one of the men. The scar running across his face was like a signature of the violence he carried. Cliché, but common for at least 70% of the people around here. Scars were worn like badges or silent warnings. For a moment, we both froze. I felt myself losing strength, nearly fainting. His eyes locked onto mine, and the shock in his expression was the only thing keeping me conscious. It was as if he hadn't expected to find me there. So vulnerable, so human. Then, the most unexpected thing happened. He shut the door abruptly. The sound echoed like thunder in the small space. I heard him say the room was empty. The other guy protested angrily, throwing something against the wall. I don't know why he chose to help me. Maybe he mistook me for someone else. Maybe for a moment, he felt pity. But it doesn't matter. What matters is that they left, and I was still there, trembling. I think I stayed in that closet until silence completely took over the house. I don't know how long. My body was numb, but my mind was still spinning from the terror of the encounter. I only came out when I was absolutely sure they were gone. The house was a war zone. Broken furniture, shattered glass, destroyed belongings. Caleb never came back. The police say they're investigating, but answers are slow to come. I don't blame them. I know I live in a place where human life means little. I live in fear. Every noise, every shadow makes me jump. Cold feels even harsher now. I don't know what happened to Caleb. I don't know if he's alive. And most of all, I don't know if they'll come back.